When 9-year-old Lily saw the big biker's keys lying on the sticky bar top, a desperate plan formed in her small, terrified mind. While her mother and a man whose name she did not want to remember screamed at each other, she watched the biker, a mountain of leather and denim named Styx, who had been quietly nursing a soda in the corner. As the fight escalated into a storm of slurred words and thrown beer, Lily's small hand darted out, snatching the heavy, jangling keys before retreating into the shadows. She was not stealing them, she was buying time, creating an anchor in the chaos. That single, silent act of defiance, born from the pure instinct of a child who knew what came after the yelling, set off a chain of events that would not only save her from the darkness of that night, but would fundamentally alter the course of her entire life. All because a man she had never met chose to see the girl instead of the thief. The Rusty Mug was the kind of place that clung to the edge of town, like a barnacle on a forgotten ship. It smelled of stale beer, regret, and the faint, greasy promise of fried food that had been sitting under a heat lamp for too long. The light inside was always dim, as if the sun itself was ashamed to look directly at the patrons who gathered there. For most, it was an escape. For Cole, known to his brothers in the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club as Styx, it was just a place to wait. Styx was 42 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite and left out in the sun and rain. His hair was short, his beard neatly trimmed, but his eyes were what people noticed. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they missed nothing. It was a trait he had honed over 12 years in the Marine Corps, a lifetime ago in places far dustier and more dangerous than this. Now he wore the cut of his club, a leather vest bearing the insignia of the Iron Sentinels, a symbol of brotherhood and a code he lived by. He sat alone at a small table in the corner, his back to the wall, a habit he could never shake. His motorcycle, a gleaming black Harley that was his pride and therapy, was parked just outside the grimy front window. He was waiting for his club brothers. They were supposed to meet here before a charity ride for a local children's hospital, an event the Iron Sentinels took more seriously than almost anything else. He was nursing a club soda, the bubbles a quiet fizz in the loud, oppressive atmosphere of the bar. And that was when he noticed her. She was a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, with hair the color of straw and eyes that were too old for her face. She sat at the bar on a stool that was too tall for her small legs dangling inches from the floor. She was trying to make herself invisible, a skill that children in her situation learn far too early. He saw the way she hunched her shoulders, the way she kept her gaze fixed on the dirty countertop in front of her, a glass of flat cola untouched. With her was a woman he assumed was her mother. The woman was loud, her laughter sharp and brittle. She was draped over a man with a mean-looking face and a tattoo of a coiled snake on his neck. The man's name was Rick, and he was buying the woman, Sharon, drink after drink. Styx had seen men like Rick before. They moved with an oily confidence that was really just a thin shell over a core of rage. Styx felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same feeling he used to get on patrol, the silent alarm that screamed when something was profoundly wrong. The scene was wrong. A child did not belong in a place like this, at this hour, surrounded by this kind of casual decay. The way the mother ignored her, the way the man occasionally glanced at the girl with a look of pure annoyance, it all set his teeth on edge. He saw the worn-out sneakers on the girl's feet, the faint yellowish bruise peeking out from the collar of her faded t-shirt. He saw the way she flinched when the man, Rick, slammed his empty glass on the bar and demanded another. He saw everything the other patrons chose to ignore. They were here to forget their own troubles, not to take on the troubles of a silent, forgotten little girl. But Styx was not built that way. His entire life, first as a Marine and now as an Iron Sentinel, was built on a simple premise. You protect the vulnerable. You stand in the gap. He had learned that a threat doesn't always announce itself with a gunshot. Sometimes it whispers from a dark corner of a forgotten bar. He kept watching, his calm exterior a perfect mask for the storm of calculations happening inside his head. He cataloged the exits. He noted the man's size and demeanor. He clocked the bartender, a weary-looking man who just wanted to get through his shift without trouble. And he kept his eyes on the girl. Her name, he would learn later, was Lily. But in that moment, she was just a small, flickering candle in a room full of gathering darkness. The argument started quietly, a low hiss between the mother and her boyfriend. It was about money. It was always about money in places like this. The man's voice grew louder, laced with a venom that made the air feel thick and heavy. The mother's responses became shrill, defensive. Lily, the little girl, seemed to shrink even further into herself. She pressed her hands over her ears, a futile gesture against the rising tide of anger. Styx saw her small body trembling. He knew what a scared kid looked like. He had seen them in war-torn villages and at the scenes of domestic calls back when he'd briefly considered becoming a cop. Fear had a universal language, and this child was fluent in it. Styx had left his keys on the table in front of him, next to his untouched soda. It was a habit, a way of grounding himself. The weight of them, the collection of metal that connected him to his bike, his home, his life, was a comfort. He saw the girl's old eyes flicker from the shouting adults to his table. She saw the keys. The fight between Sharon and Rick reached a new peak. Rick stood up, knocking his stool over with a loud crash. "I'm done with this. I'm done with you," he roared, his face a mask of crimson fury. "You can't just leave," Sharon shrieked, grabbing his arm. "You owe me." In that moment of explosive distraction, as every eye in the bar turned to the drama unfolding, Styx saw a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. It was Lily. She slid off her stool with a practiced silence that broke his heart. She moved with the stealth of a field mouse, her small form barely a whisper against the sticky floor. Her path was not toward the door. It was not toward her mother. It was toward his table. Her hand, impossibly small and quick, shot out and closed around his keys. The metal made a faint, muffled clink as she snatched them. She did not run. She simply melted back toward the dark corner near the restrooms, her small body swallowed by the shadows. She clutched the keys to her chest like a holy relic. Styx did not move. His blood went cold, but not with anger. It was a cold shock of understanding. She wasn't stealing his keys to be a delinquent. She wasn't a thief. He saw the desperate, flawed logic of a child in an impossible situation. The big, scary-looking man on the motorcycle was her only hope. If he couldn't leave, he couldn't abandon her. He would have to stay. He would have to see what was happening. It was the most desperate signal he had ever received. It was a flare shot up in the dark, a silent scream for help. Her small, trembling hand, wrapped around the keys to his freedom, was a prayer. And in that instant, Cole Styx Callahan made a decision. He was no longer just a bystander waiting for his friends. He was now a part of this. He was the only one who had seen her desperate act, and he was the only one who understood it. The fight at the bar was devolving. Rick shoved Sharon away from him. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the bar. "Don't you touch me," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Or what?" he sneered, stepping toward her. Styx knew this was the moment. The split-second decision was no decision at all. It was an inevitability. The risk of being wrong, of getting involved in a simple domestic squabble, was nothing compared to the image of that little girl's face, the ancient fear in her eyes. He thought of the club's motto, etched into a plaque back at their clubhouse, Fortis et Liber, strong and free. But what good was strength if you didn't use it to help someone who was neither? He stood up. His chair scraping against the floor was a sound that cut through the argument like a gunshot. He was a big man, 6'3", and built of solid muscle earned in the gym and on the road. His presence alone shifted the gravity in the room. Rick and Sharon stopped their shouting and turned to look at him. "What do you want?" Rick snarled, trying to project an authority he didn't have. "This ain't your business, biker." Styx ignored him. His gaze was fixed on the dark corner where Lily was hiding. He took a slow, deliberate step in that direction. He needed to get to her. That was the only mission now. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Rick shouted, stepping forward to block his path. "You're in our way." "Move," Styx said. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that held no room for negotiation. It was the voice he had used to command men under fire, a voice that promised consequences. Rick, fueled by cheap liquor and a lifetime of bad choices, puffed out his chest. "Make me," he said, a stupid, smug grin on his face. Styx didn't want to fight. A fight would bring cops, and cops would complicate things. A fight would scare the girl even more. He needed to de-escalate, to control the situation. But he also knew that sometimes, the only way to put out a fire is to smother it. Before Rick could make another move, Styx took another step forward, entering the man's personal space. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked down at him, his pale blue eyes like chips of ice. "I'm going to walk over to that little girl," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And you are not going to be in my way when I do it. Do you understand me?" The threat wasn't in the words, but in the chilling certainty behind them. Rick's drunken bravado began to falter. He saw something in Styx's eyes that he recognized and feared. A man who had been to the edge and back. A man who was utterly without fear. But just as Rick was about to back down, Sharon, the mother, lunged forward. "You leave her alone!" she shrieked, not at Rick, but at Styx. "She's my daughter, you can't just—" Her words were cut short as Rick, his anger now redirected, spun around and shoved her hard. "Shut up, you stupid!" The shove was too hard. Sharon lost her footing on the slick floor and went down, her head hitting the leg of a bar stool with a sickening thud. She lay still. The bar went silent. And then Rick did the one thing that sealed his fate. He looked at the crumpled form of the woman on the floor, then at the stunned faces around the bar, and his eyes, wide with panic, landed on Lily, who had crept out of the corner, her face a mask of pure terror. "This is your fault!" he screamed at the little girl. He took a step toward her, his hand raised. That was it. The line had been crossed. Styx moved faster than a man his size had any right to. In 2 long strides, he was between Rick and the girl. He didn't throw a punch. He simply put his hand flat on Rick's chest and pushed. It was not a violent shove, but it was backed by 250 pounds of immovable purpose. Rick stumbled backward, tripping over the stool he had knocked over earlier and landing in a heap on the floor. Styx didn't even give him a second glance. He turned and knelt down in front of Lily. He made himself as small as he could, trying to seem less intimidating. Her whole body was shaking, and tears were streaming down her face, silent and hot. In her tightly clenched fist, he could see the edge of his Harley key. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." From the floor, Rick scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "You're dead, biker," he howled, grabbing a beer bottle from a nearby table. Styx didn't even turn around. He heard the roar of engines outside. His brothers. Right on time. The door to the Rusty Mug flew open, and 3 large men in Iron Sentinel's cuts filled the doorway. There was Beast, the club president, a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear and win. There was Doc, the club's former Navy corpsman. And there was Ghost, the quiet, watchful sergeant-at-arms. They took in the scene in an instant. Styx kneeling in front of a terrified child, a woman unconscious on the floor, and a man with a broken bottle advancing on their brother's back. "Problem, Styx?" Beast asked, his voice a low growl. "Little one," Styx replied, never taking his eyes off Lily. "Handle it." It was over before it began. Ghost disarmed Rick with a swift, practiced movement that twisted the man's wrist until he cried out and dropped the bottle. Beast grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off his feet, holding him against the wall like a misbehaving child. Doc was already kneeling beside Sharon, checking her pulse and breathing. "Call 911, Doc said calmly. "She has a pulse, but she needs a hospital." Styx gently reached out his hand, palm up, toward Lily. "Can I have my keys back now, little one?" he asked gently. Her tiny, trembling hand opened, and she placed the keys in his palm. Her touch was as light as a feather. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You were very brave." He scooped her up into his arms. She was so light, she felt like she was made of nothing but fear and air. She didn't fight him. Instead, she buried her face in the rough leather of his vest and clung to him, her small body racked with silent sobs. He held her tight, one hand protectively on the back of her head, and stood up. He walked her right past the sputtering, captive Rick, past the gawking patrons, and out the door into the cool, clean night air. The flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance soon painted the parking lot in strobing reds and blues. The scene inside the Rusty Mug was quickly taken over by uniformed officers and paramedics. Rick was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, his drunken protests falling on deaf ears. Sharon was carefully loaded onto a gurney, a neck brace secured around her, and taken to the hospital. Styx stood by his bike, holding Lily. He had wrapped her in his own jacket, the heavy leather dwarfing her small frame. She had stopped crying, but she still held on to him with a desperate strength. He just stood there, rocking her gently, murmuring quiet, soothing words. His brothers formed a protective circle around them, their large bodies a solid wall against the chaos and the curious eyes. A police officer, a man named Sergeant Miller, with tired eyes and a kind face, approached them. He had already taken statements from the bartender and a few of the less intoxicated patrons. He looked at Styx, at the little girl in his arms, and at the formidable-looking bikers surrounding them. "You're Cole Callahan? Styx?" Miller asked, looking at his notepad. "That's me," Styx replied. "The bartender said the kid took your keys," Miller stated, more a question than an accusation. "She was scared," Styx said simply. "She needed someone to stay." Miller looked at Lily, whose face was still hidden in Styx's vest. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "We see a lot of this. Too much of it. The boyfriend, Rick, has a record of domestic assault. Mom's name is Sharon. We've had calls to their address before, never with enough to make anything stick." He paused, then looked directly at Styx. "Tonight, you made it stick. By not losing your cool, by protecting her instead of worrying about your property, you gave us what we needed. You're a witness. More than that, you're the reason she's not in the hospital, or worse." A female officer approached, her demeanor gentle and professional. She was a social worker who had been called to the scene. "Hi there," she said softly, directing her words toward the small bundle in Styx's arms. "My name is Maria. I'm here to help you." Lily tightened her grip on Styx's vest. She peeked out at the woman, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "It's okay," Styx murmured to her. "She's a good guy. She's going to make sure you're safe tonight." He had to let her go. He knew it was the right thing, the only thing, but it felt like tearing off a piece of himself. He knelt down again, so he was eye level with her. "Listen to me, little one," he said, his voice earnest. "You are brave and you are smart. What you did in there, that was one of the smartest things I've ever seen. You hear me?" She gave a tiny, hesitant nod. He reached up and unpinned a small silver pin from his vest. It was his old Marine Corps insignia, a small eagle, globe, and anchor. It was worn and smooth from years of being touched. He pressed it into her small hand. "You hold on to this for me, okay?" he said. "It's for brave people. And if you ever feel scared, you just hold it tight and remember that you've got a friend named Styx who thinks you're the toughest kid in the world." A tear finally escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She whispered a single, tiny word. "Okay." He watched as she took Maria's hand and walked toward the unmarked car. She looked back once, her small hand clutching the silver pin, before disappearing inside. Styx stood up, feeling a profound and aching emptiness. The night was over. She was safe. But for him, something had just begun. He had her keys. He could mount up and ride away. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could never ride far enough to leave that little girl behind. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and restless nights. Styx gave his official statement, a clear, concise account of the events at the Rusty Mug. His testimony, combined with Rick's violent outburst and Sharon's history of neglect, was more than enough. Rick was charged with assault and child endangerment. Sharon, upon her release from the hospital with a concussion and a few bruises, lost custody of her daughter and was mandated to attend rehabilitation programs. Lily was placed into the foster care system. Styx couldn't shake her from his mind. He would be out on a ride with his brothers, the thunder of 20 Harleys shaking the asphalt, and all he could see were her old, frightened eyes. He would be at the clubhouse, sharing a laugh and a beer, and all he could hear was the whisper of her small voice. The world, which had once felt so straightforward, now seemed to have a lily-shaped hole in it. He had sobered up from the adrenaline of that night, but the impact had stained him permanently. This was not a problem he could solve with his fists or his brothers. This was a different kind of fight. He started making calls. He called Sergeant Miller, who pointed him toward the county's Department of Family Services. He navigated a labyrinth of bureaucracy, of overworked case managers and endless hold music. He was not family. He was not a relative. He was just a biker who had been in the right place at the wrong time. But he was persistent. He learned that Lily was in a temporary group home. He learned that her future was uncertain. She had no other family willing or able to take her in. She was a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet, a statistic in the making. One evening, he was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the phone, feeling more helpless than he ever had in a combat zone. His wife, Clara, a nurse with a spirit as strong and gentle as his was rough and protective, sat down across from him. She had been watching him struggle for weeks. "You can't save the whole world, Cole," she said softly. "I know," he rumbled, his voice thick with frustration. "But maybe I can just save one part of it." He looked at her, his tough guy facade crumbling. "I can't just let her disappear into the system, Clara. I can't. I saw her. I really saw her. And she saw me." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "I know," she said. A long silence settled between them, filled with unspoken understanding. They had tried for children years ago, but it was not meant to be. They had built a good life, just the two of them, a life of club runs and hospital shifts, of quiet nights and shared dreams. "So what are we going to do about it?" she asked finally, her voice firm. The "we" hit him like a physical blow. He looked at his wife, at the love and strength in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in his gut began to loosen. The process was long and arduous. They had to become licensed foster parents. There were background checks, home inspections, interviews, and hours of training classes. The Iron Sentinels, his tough-as-nails brothers, rallied around them. They showed up on a Saturday and repainted the spare bedroom in a soft, sunny yellow. They built a bookshelf and a small desk. They even went, awkwardly and in a large group, to a toy store and bought dolls and art supplies, gruffly asking the sales clerks for advice. They turned Styx's personal mission into a club-wide operation. 6 months after that night at the Rusty Mug, Cole and Clara Callahan welcomed a very quiet, very timid 9-year-old girl into their home. The first few weeks were difficult. Lily barely spoke. She ate her meals in silence and spent hours in her new room, just sitting on her bed, clutching the small, worn Marine Corps pins Styx had given her. She was terrified that this, too, was temporary. She had learned that homes were not forever. Styx and Clara were patient. They did not push. They created a world of quiet routine and unwavering stability. Clara would read to her at night. Styx would sit on the porch with her after dinner, not saying a word, just being a steady, solid presence beside her. He taught her how to check the oil on his Harley. He showed her how to tune a guitar. Slowly, painstakingly, they were building a bridge to her. The breakthrough came one afternoon. Styx was in the garage, polishing the chrome on his bike, when Lily came and stood in the doorway. She was holding a piece of paper. "What's that, little one?" he asked. She walked over and handed it to him. It was a drawing, done in crayon. It depicted a huge, smiling man in a leather vest, with a tiny girl holding his hand. Above them, the sun was a brilliant, happy yellow. He felt his throat tighten. "It's good," he managed to say. "It's really good." She pointed to the man in the drawing. "Styx," she said, her voice small. Then she pointed to the little girl. "Lily." Then her finger moved to the space between their hands. "Family," she whispered. It was more than a drawing. It was a beginning. 2 years later, the adoption was finalized. In a quiet courtroom, surrounded by a dozen large, leather-clad bikers who cried without shame, Lily Callahan officially became their daughter. The change in her was a miracle. The quiet, fearful child blossomed. Laughter filled the Callahan house. She joined the school soccer team. She made friends. She still had moments of sadness, shadows from her past, but now she had a family to help her through them. She called Styx Dad. The first time she said it, he had to go into the garage for a full 10 minutes to fix something, because he couldn't let her see him weeping with joy. The impact of that night rippled outward. Inspired by Lily's story, the Iron Sentinels MC started a new charity initiative called Lily's Ride. Every year, they organized a massive motorcycle run to raise money and awareness for abused and neglected children in their state. Styx, once just a quiet member, became the face of the foundation. He spoke at events, his words simple but powerful, telling the story of a brave little girl who stole his keys and ended up stealing his heart. Years passed. Lily grew from a girl into a young woman, bright and compassionate and strong. She graduated high school at the top of her class, her proud father and mother in the front row, flanked by an entire motorcycle club who considered her their own. She decided to study social work, to become a person like Maria, the woman who had taken her hand all those years ago. She wanted to be the one who showed up in the dark and offered a light. On her 18th birthday, Styx gave her a set of keys. They weren't for a motorcycle, but for a safe, reliable sedan he and Clara had bought for her. Tucked onto the keychain was a small silver charm. It was the eagle, globe, and anchor he had given her in the parking lot of the Rusty Mug. She looked at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you for seeing me, Dad," she said. "Always, little one," he replied, his voice thick. "Always." He thought back to that night, to the anger and the fear and the desperation in a grimy little bar. He had thought he was waiting for his friends. He had thought he was just passing time. He realized now he had been waiting his whole life for her. A man's strength, he had learned, is not measured by the weight he can lift or the fear he can inspire. It is measured by the gentleness he can show, the protection he can offer, and the love he is willing to give. He had walked into that bar a biker. He had walked out a father. And in saving her, he had truly, finally, saved himself.